So, 1968. I was not alive. Some of you were. I won't point fingers. But 1968 was a very important year. It was the first ever national broadcast of a show called Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. It's a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Now listen, this is a children's TV show with, puppets and stuff. And yet it had such a significant impact on society that in 2003, the United States Senate passed Resolution 16 commemorating the life of Fred Rogers. And in that resolution, you read these words. Through his spirituality and placid nature, Mr. Rogers was able to reach out to our nation's children and encourage each of them to understand the important role they play in their communities and as part of their families. More importantly, he did not shy away from dealing with difficult issues of death and divorce, but rather encouraged children to express their emotions in a healthy, constructive manner, often providing a simple answer to life's hardships. And I might add, he made cardigans awesome. All right? Bottom line, Mr. Rogers was the man. He was the man. This is what he did. Day after day, he had this amazing ability to take these complex situations and boil them down to the simplest of truths that were so easy that a kid could understand them. But you know what? I think parents were paying attention as well. As he taught us not only what it meant to really truly be a good person, but what it also means to be a neighbor. So welcome to week 1 of Won't You Be My Neighbor. If you have been invited here by your neighbor, if you are a neighbor, a friend, a coworker that has been, and this is your first time here, we're just excited that you're here with us. I'm going to start by telling the story of how this church got started, just in a snapshot. My wife and I were called to start this church together about 2007. We were wrestling with that, and we fought it pretty hard. We didn't want to do it for lots of reasons, most of them having to do with the fact that we were scared out of our minds of failing. But one of the biggest reasons was actually personal to me. It's because they were wanting us to start a church in Sioux Falls. And Sioux Falls is my neighborhood. I grew up here. I went to Roosevelt High School, 40-7 on Friday night. Congratulations, varsity. I'm just saying. I went to Roosevelt High School, so this is and I left Sioux Falls, and I said, I'm never coming back again. And God said, show us what you know. And here I am. And yet, isn't it true that it's hardest to share our faith with those closest to us? Now, let me be honest. I would have been willing to follow God anywhere. God, you take me wherever you want. But there's something about, the fact that God has called us to certain places. He's put us in certain neighborhoods, in certain jobs, in certain environments, and He's given us a call in those environments to be a neighbor. And yet, so many of us, we're scared to reach those who are closest to us. So we're going to do an activity to loosen things up. You just received a quarter sheet of paper. You're going to get that out, and I want to see your art skills. If you were looking down from an airplane at the houses and they were just all little boxes, I want you to draw your street that you live on. Draw the boxes on one side. How many houses are on this side? How many houses are on this? Or if you're in an apartment, how many apartments are on my floor each way, and then I want you to label where this is where we live. And then I want you to do something a little harder. I want you to put names in those boxes, if you know them. If you don't, leave it blank. And in order to inspire you and get your creative juices flowing, we have a little music for you to enjoy. So enjoy this music and draw your street. Why are you watching me? Do your sheet.
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood.
Feel free to sing it if you know it.
For a neighbor, would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood. A neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you, so Let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please won't you be my neighbor?
All right, neighbors.
Welcome to
How are your drawings going? You got your maps done? You can keep working on it if you need to. The map that you just drew, the map that you're drawing, how many houses can you give names to? And more importantly, how many are just blank? You don't know them. Now, I love what God is doing at the Ransom Church. I love what He's doing at our downtown campus and our Harrisburg campus and in the nursing homes and at the county jail. And for the people watching online, I love that we're serving free of ourselves all over our communities and beyond. But I started realizing something tragic. I realized that we're doing ministry for everyone except our neighbors. How many of you live greater than 1 mile from this campus? Yeah, like the majority of us. Which means this is not your neighborhood. Now, if you live in Sioux Falls, you can make the argument, it's still my community, but you know what I mean. This is not your neighbor. What would happen to the Ransom? What would happen to Sioux Falls and to Harrisburg and to the surrounding communities if we started being good neighbors? If we started praying for our neighbors, loving on our neighbors, if we began to serve them, we began to invite them into our home, invite them into our lives. What if we chose to focus on where we live, right here and right now, as missionaries to our neighborhoods? So turn with me to Luke chapter 10, if you will. If you're using one of our Bibles, we'll be on page 623. If you didn't bring a Bible, raise your hand. The ushers will bring you one. You can follow along. If you don't own a Bible, just keep it. This is our gift to you. We want you to have God's Word as part of your life. But Luke chapter 10, page 623, I'm going to set the scene here for this story. There's a religious teacher, an expert in religious law. We'll just call him a lawyer, okay? So there's this lawyer, and he shows up and he wants to test Jesus, which is something that you see in Scripture that's not unusual. A lot of times the lawyer or the leader, religious leader, has an agenda. They want to make Jesus look bad. That may or may not have been the case here. It was actually pretty common to test rabbis to say, hey, what do you believe about this? Kind of sum everything up. What are your thoughts on this issue? When you had the Jewish law with 613 rules and regulations, it would not be unusual for people to say to a rabbi of some sort, why don't you just sum this up? Give me your thoughts on this. That's what's going on here. So we pick it up, Luke chapter 10, starting with verse 25. One day an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question, Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life? Now I want to point out a couple of things here. The first thing I want to point out is that he stood up. Why is that important? Because it means he was sitting down. Yes, he was sitting down. That's not a trick question. He's sitting down. Why is that important? Because it means that Jesus was teaching. Jesus was teaching, and everybody's sitting around listening, as was custom. You would sit down around the teacher, and Jesus says something that catches this guy's attention. Enough so that he stands up, he interrupts, and he says, Jesus, hold on a second. Will you do me a favor? Will you just sum this all up? Like, I hear what you're saying. I get it, but just sum it up. What do I need to do to be saved? That's the second thing that I want you to note. This phrase, what should I do? The picture here is, how do I get to heaven? How do I earn my way? He had the same picture in his mind that most religions did, that salvation or enlightenment or whatever the religion you're part of, like the goal is to get somewhere, and the only way to get there is to work for it, to be good enough. And so he's wanting to know, how do I work for it? What's the bottom line? What do I need to do? When do I need to do it? How often? Just give me the list, so I can check the boxes. Done, done, done. And I can know I'm good to go. Now, if we can just hit the pause button, this is where I think most of the church is today. I think that most Christians and most people who are exploring the Christian faith, this is the question we want answered. A lot of people are like, this is why I go to church. Just like, give me the list, tell me what I got to do so I can just, go to heaven. What are my boxes? How do I guarantee heaven? That's how most people navigate their faith. And the fact that this question's been asked for centuries, the problem is it's just the wrong question. Now watch what Jesus does. Jesus knows this is the wrong question. In fact, we're all asking the wrong question. That's why he came. He came because we're trying to figure out how we can be good enough, how we can do enough, and we can't. He knew that we would need him to die in our place to pay our price so we could receive God's grace. So he knows this guy's asking the wrong question, but he humors him. Okay? Verse 26. Jesus replied, "What does the law of Moses say? How do you read it?" The man answered, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "Right," Jesus told him, "do this and you'll live." So Jesus says, "All right, you're a lawyer. What does the law say?" And the guy gives the expected answer. In fact, he goes above and beyond. He takes two verses and he shoves them together. He takes the one they would have expected, which is Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5, which was known as the Shema. It was a very important verse to the Hebrews. Love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, strength. And he says, also, Leviticus 19:18 says, love your neighbor as yourself. And he takes these two verses and he shoves them together. Now, I'm not sure why he went the extra mile like this. Maybe because Jesus did it in Matthew 22. Maybe he was there when Jesus preached that. But whatever reason, he looks at all these rules and regulations. He says, as I understand it, they all boil down to love God, love your neighbors. And Jesus says, yeah, I agree. You've answered correctly. Do that and you will live. Now, how many ever get dressed in a hurry? You ever had to get dressed in a hurry? You're rushing. That's the worst, right? And I only ever have to do this when I dress up, which, as you can tell, ain't often. I'm a t-shirt and jeans guy, but when I have to dress up, it's usually for a wedding. Most likely one that I'm about to perform, and I'm running late. And I don't want to even talk about that. That's another story. But I'm 37 years old, right? You would think I had this figured out yet, and yet somehow, probably like half the time I end up in the car, and there's something like off in the buttons, you know? And like you think I know how to dress myself. Like, Phil, start at the top, get the first one right, everything else falls into place, right? Well, that's what's happening here. The religious leader's saying, what's the first button? What's that thing in my faith that if I do it, everything else falls into place? And what they determined was, love God, love others. Everything else falls into place after that. Together, those are often called the whole duty of man. Jesus calls these the two greatest commandments. In Matthew 22, verse 40, he says, the entire law and all the demands of the prophets, in other words, the entirety of our Bible, of Scripture, is based on these two commandments. Now, this is where the lawyer should have stopped, right? Okay, I got it. Thanks, Jesus. Love God, love others. I don't do either of those perfectly. Do you? You know, he should have been like, no, I don't have those down yet. I'll work on those. Thanks, just wanted to check. It's not what he does. He does what you and I always try to do. He tries to justify himself. Look at verse 29. The man wanted to justify his actions, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Dude, leave it alone. But he doesn't. He says, so who's my neighbor? Now that's the focus of our entire message. Here we are in a series, Won't You Be My Neighbor? And the first question we think about asking is, who is my neighbor? Jesus told us, love your neighbor as yourself. This guy asked what seems like a reasonable question. Okay, cool. Who's my neighbor? The problem is it's the wrong question again. And the reason it's the wrong question is because it's a question of excuse. It's a question we ask when we are trying to excuse ourselves from loving certain people because they're not my neighbor. Let me rephrase this a little differently. This would be like asking the question, who in Sioux Falls do we need to love and who do we not have to love? Right? Who should I share Christ with and who do I not have to share Christ with? Like when you hear it that way, it's like, yeah, that's kind of ridiculous. And yet we all ask this question, who is my neighbor? When he asks this question, what he's really asking is, who do I need to love and who do I have permission to not love? Jesus doesn't answer his question, he just tells him a story. Let's pick up that story in verse 30. Jesus replied with a story. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along. But when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed by him. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Then a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, take care of this man. If the bill runs higher, here's my credit card number. I'll pay you the next time that I'm here. Now listen, chances are you've heard this story. If you even went to church a little bit as a kid, if you grew up going to church, you know the parable of the Good Samaritan. I want to point out some key thoughts, though. First is a key thought about the victim. This passage says that he was a Jewish person. Some scholars would argue that we don't even know that he's Jewish. In fact, they would argue we don't know anything about the victim. We don't know if he's wealthy or if he's poor. We don't know if he's conservative or liberal. Does he like Donald Trump? I don't know. We don't know if he's good or bad. We know nothing about him. But we know one thing about him. One thing. He's human. Now you might go, duh, right? That's not important. No, it is. In fact, it's important enough, I want you to write it down in the side of your notes. Write down, he's human. Circle it. We're going to come back to that. He's human. Now we know much more about the people passing by. The first guy was a priest. He knew the law. He was a religious leader. He knew what the law said about dead bodies. He knew that if he went over to help this guy and he touched him and the guy ended up being dead, he was out of a job for a week. He was ceremonially unclean. He couldn't do his job. So it's not even that this guy was a bad guy. In fact, let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Let's say he felt compassion on him. He probably came along, oh, that's terrible. But the problem is, in his compassion, he weighed that against the cost of helping. He did a cost-benefit analysis. Yes, this guy needs help, but what will it cost me? And in that moment, he decided to step over here and keep going. Then we have a temple assistant, a Levite, very similar situation, not as many restrictions, but same type of thing. If he touched this guy, he's out of a job for a while, so he did the same thing. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt. He saw the guy. Maybe he had compassion too. Oh, dude, man, sucks to be you. And then he stepped over here and kept going. Now, the third guy is a Samaritan. This is super important, okay? You need to understand the background here. We're talking about centuries of animosity behind this, because Jews and Samaritans hated each other in a way that maybe no two groups of people ever have since. Let me try to put it in perspective. After Israel was defeated by Babylon, there were a group of Jews that stayed behind. They intermarried and even built their own temple. And the Jews hated these people. They called them the Samaritans, and they considered the Samaritans to be half-breeds. Now, let me explain that. It means they saw them as less than what? Human. They're not even human. In fact, they would go to the temple, and the religious leaders would actually pray that God would not save these less than human people. They would actually, how much do you have to hate somebody to go to church and pray them to hell? That's what's going on in this scenario. In fact, there's an old ancient writing written in 200 BC called The Wisdom of Ben Sirach, and it kind of captures the heart of people. It says this: there are two nations that my soul detests. The third is not a nation at all. The inhabitants of Mount Seir, that was a group called the Edomites, and the Philistines, watch, and the stupid people living in Shechem, that's the Samaritans. Those stupid people. That's the animosity between these two groups. Now, Jesus is making a point here I want you to see. He doesn't call the story the good person. He calls the story the good Samaritan. In other words, he calls it the good half-person. And what he does, see, parables always have something hidden in them, something shocking to wrestle with. This one's a huge one. He chooses to have the most rejected person be the one to show mercy to the victim. He chooses to take a person that isn't even viewed as human and have that person do the only humane thing. In fact, the only person in the story with any humanity is the person not considered human. And the temple leaders are incredibly inhumane. Now, isn't that interesting? And what he does is he teaches us something. He teaches us that being a neighbor isn't about proximity or culture or preference. It's not about sharing the same religion. It's not about sharing the same socioeconomic class. It's not about any of those things. Being a neighbor is caring for those people maybe you wouldn't even normally have a relationship with. Let me put it this way. Following Jesus means being a neighbor. It means being a neighbor. When the religious leader asked this question, he wasn't asking, who is my neighbor? He was really asking, who isn't my neighbor? Who do I not have to love? Who do I have permission not to love? And you might say, that's terrible. Do we not do this all the time? I know I do. How many of you ever caught yourself trying to justify inaction in helping other people by telling yourselves things about those people that make it seem okay to not help them and not do what you ought to do? Oh, but they're just going to waste the money. Oh, but they believe in things I don't believe in. Oh, but they're just bad people. What does it look like to be a neighbor to someone you completely disagree with? To be a follower of Christ is a call to love like Jesus did and a call to love whom Jesus did, which means having mercy on those around us. It means being a neighbor to everyone. It means your job is to make it a beautiful day in the neighborhood. To just walk around and be like, won't you be mine? Won't you be? Please, won't you be my neighbor? Now, please don't do that. That's really cheesy. But the point is this. We do outreach events, right? We have a compassion side of what we do, serve free of self. We get out there and we do events on the calendar that are compassion focused. But listen, compassion isn't a church event. Compassion is a mindset. It's a heart for people. Compassion is choosing to do the right thing for your neighbor right where God has placed you without the church having to put it on the calendar. It's just looking around and going, who in my life needs a neighbor? Who in my life around me is broken and hurting? Go help that person. You're the hands and feet of Christ in your neighborhood. I don't even live there. In fact, look at what Jesus asked this man in Luke chapter 10, following the story, verse 36. He tells his story and then he says, now which of these three would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? Jesus asked, the man replied, the one who showed him mercy. Then Jesus said, yes, now go and do the same. So today I want to give you some practical applications to what it means to love your neighbor. What does it take? Number one, love requires attention. Love requires attention. I know this seems really like self-explanatory, but I don't think we do it very well. To love your neighbor, you first need to see your neighbor. You need to see the needs around you, which means you need to actually know your neighbor. I know, crazy. Now listen, notice what Jesus does. The man says, who's my neighbor? Jesus doesn't answer. He tells him a story, and then he turns the question back on him. Okay, so now you tell me, who's your neighbor? But when Jesus says it, he's not saying, who do you have to love, who do you not have to love? He's saying, do you even see your neighbor? Do you see the people right around you? See, it's one thing to sit in church and acknowledge the truth. Yes, the two greatest commandments are love God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's another thing completely to define neighbor, isn't it? It's another thing completely to see your neighbor. And it's not enough to just see them. Number two, love requires affection. It requires affection. In other words, you need to not only see your neighbor, you need to feel for people. You need to have a heart that breaks for those around you. It's so easy in this world to become so calloused in life because there's just so much bad stuff out there. It takes a lot of intentionality, doesn't it, to know your neighbors, particularly because some of them don't want to be known. But it takes, beyond intentionality, it takes courage to actually invest emotionally in their hurts. Too often it's easier just to ignore the needs of those around us. Maybe we even have compassion a little bit, but we just keep walking, right? George Bernard Shaw describes that this way. He says, the worst sin toward our fellow creatures is not to hate them, but to be indifferent to them. That's the essence of inhumanity. Indifference is the essence of inhumanity. I think that's really the key to loving our neighbors. We not only have to see them, we have to see them as human. Do you see people around you as human? Now, I don't know all your neighbors, but I do know something about them. They're human. And I know some of you are like, no, they are. I promise. No matter how much you like them or dislike them, they're actually human, you know? Which means they're children of God. They have value. They were created in His image. They are not just a face. They are not just a house number down the street. They are people created in God's image, loved dearly by Him, but a lot of them are lost. They're far from Him. And as believers, that makes them our responsibility. Your neighborhood is your responsibility. Which leads to number 3. Why does there have to be a number 3? Number 3 is where God gets pesky. Number 2 is always like, care about them and pray. And then there's a number 3. Love requires action. Darn. This is where it gets messy. All three people saw the man. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt. All three people had compassion on the man. What set the Samaritan apart was action. He counted the cost and he got involved. There's a story I shared before, but I love it so much I'm going to share it again. A man went to the doctor because he just wasn't feeling right. You know, he didn't feel well, and the doctor said, "Man, you're really, really sick. I can't even diagnose necessarily, put my finger on it. I can sense that you're not eating right. You're wasting away. You're under a lot of stress. Unless something changes, I don't think you're going to live very long. I mean, this is serious. So you need to go home and you need to tell your wife that she has to cook nutritious meals, like all the time. Right? Home-cooked, nutritious meals. Tell her that she needs to reduce your stress. So tell her that she needs to keep the kids off your back. In fact, tell her that she needs to make a budget and then stick to it. Right? She needs to take the financial pressure off you. And if she does all these things, you'll be fine. You should recover. If she doesn't, you'll probably be dead in like a month." The man was very somber and shaken, and the doctor said, you're going to tell your wife? He said, "Actually, would you call my wife? I think she would take it better from you." And the doctor said, "Absolutely." So the doctor went and he called the wife, and the man drove home. When he got home, his wife rushed to him, and she was just crying. And the man said, "Did the doctor call?" And yes. "What did he say?" "He said you're going to die." So listen, love is costly, right? Like, we know this. If you're married, if you got family around you, love requires action. It requires involvement. It requires that you not only see and feel the needs of people, it requires that you do something about it. This story is called the Good Samaritan. It could just be called the real neighbor. And what he does is, as you watch how the Samaritan responds, all of my excuses fall away. Let's see if you feel your excuses being ripped away from you as we go through this. He saw a need, he felt compassion, but he didn't stop. He incurred risk. He set aside his own comforts. He adjusted his plans. He invested his time. He used his own money. He even planned to follow up. I don't know about you, but all my excuses just kind of got eaten up right there. And you might say, "Well, why would he do this? Why would he do this for a perfect stranger?" I'll tell you why. Because that's what a neighbor does. Martin Luther King Jr. said the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. The true neighbor will risk his position, his prestige, and even his life for the welfare of others. In dangerous valleys and hazardous pathways, he will lift some bruised and beaten brother to a higher and more noble life. See, the right question is not, who is my neighbor? The right question is, am I willing to be a neighbor? That's really what we need to ask ourselves. Am I willing to be a neighbor? In this story, the religious leader was trying to put the emphasis on whether the man was worthy of love. Jesus was trying to put emphasis on whether the religious leader was even willing to love. The lawyer was looking for limitations to love. Jesus was looking for love without limits. The lawyer asked the question, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus said, "Wrong question. The question is, are you willing to be a neighbor?" And that's actually how the early church spread in the first century. This idea of households and neighborhoods telling each other about Jesus' love, that's how the church grew. It spread from house to house. There was no advertising campaigns. There were no church mailers. Neighborhood to neighborhood, that's how it spread. And what's crazy, if you follow the story of the church, it started with 12 guys following Jesus, culminated with 120 people in the upper room who began to love and care for their neighbors. It took just over 300 years at a growth rate of 40% per decade over the next 300 years until by 350 AD of the known population, 56.5% were followers of Jesus, which means a little over half the world came to know Jesus because 12 guys loved their neighbors, and those neighbors loved their neighbors, even the ones they didn't like. And let me tell you where it all started. When God Almighty so loved the world that he sent his Son to be our neighbor. In John chapter 1, verse 14, it says, "So the Word became human and made his home among us. He was full of unfailing love and faithfulness, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the Father's one and only Son." Or I love how the Message paraphrase puts it. It says, "The Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood." And that's what he did. Think about this. Jesus came. Certainly God saw us and felt compassion for our needs, but he did not stop there. He sent his Son into the neighborhood to act on our behalf, to identify with us, to bear our burdens, to offer us life by laying his down. And he did that for every one of us. And so our call is to be the kind of people who do that for our neighbors. In John 13, verse 34 and 35, it says, "So now I'm giving you a new commandment. Love each other. Just as I've loved you, you should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you're my disciples." So I want you to grab your map that you drew of your neighborhood. And as I want you to look at it. And as you look at it, I want you to answer these questions in your own heart. First of all, do you know them? Do you even know their name? Whether you know them or not, does your heart break for them? And then third, are you willing to do whatever it takes to reach him? If not, why not? Because Jesus was. Unless you think I'm hammering on you, unless you think for just 1 second I'm pointing the finger, my wife and I moved into a new neighborhood in July. We moved to a different house. And I did this exercise earlier this week. And we had committed, we're going to get to know our neighbors, we're going to throw a block party, we're going to be evangelistic in our neighborhood, and then we got busy. And that's true. I mean, life's busy. I mean, life's busy for all of us, right? Got a new baby, my wife's taking classes, and 1,000 good excuses, all excuses, right? And now I can tell you with confidence, I know the neighbors who live over here. He's a pastor at another church. I know the neighbor who lives over here. She's a teacher at our son's school, and she's already a Christian. I know the neighbors over there. They're my daughter's best friend's parents, and they're Christians. Other than that, bunch of blanks. And that's on me, because that's my responsibility. And this is as much a challenge to me as it is to you, because the Ransom has always been about setting captives free. We don't just want to be a church. We want to be a movement of love beyond reason, reaching every edge of our communities, every edge of our region and beyond with Christ's love, inviting people to share in God's story. And I'm going to tell you, it will not happen because of advertising. It will not happen because of great programming. It will not happen because we add services. All those things are important, but it only happens when those of us who are here commit to serve our neighbors in love. Listen, even if they're liberal or conservative or pro-life or pro-choice or from another religion or another country, none of that matters. Maybe they like cats or Pepsi or country music. I don't even know. You got to reach out. And I joke about it to give us a moment to breathe, but let me just ask you, when you see your neighbors, what do you see? Do you see people or do you see labels? Do you just go, broken family, from a different country? They would never love Jesus. Do you say they're no for them? It's so easy to do. What would it take for us to love them and serve them and hang out with them and clear our schedules for them and make time for them and listen to their stories and hear their hearts and have our hearts break with their hearts and to pray for them and to find ways to bless them and to bring hope and to be hope in our neighborhoods? Now I want you to take your map, I want you to turn it over on the blank side and write one word. I want you to write the word network. Because we all have these too. Your network is just your neighbors that you don't live by. This is your friends and your coworkers. This is the people who are the parents of the other kids your kids play sports with or have ballet recitals with or have piano recitals with. This is your book club. This is the people that are all around us every day that are missing heaven. And what we need is neighbors. We need more people committed to being neighbors. So in R3 this week, R3 groups, we're going to wrestle with these two questions. If you're not in an R3 group, I would challenge you to wrestle with these in your own personal time with God. Number one, how am I doing at being a neighbor? How am I doing at being a neighbor? And number two, what keeps me from counting the cost and being the neighbor God called me to be? What's holding me back? Let me pray for you. Heavenly Father, I pray that you would help us view the world differently. That you would help us understand that if we are believers, we have been placed in our places of work, in our neighborhoods, in the environments we're in, to be missionaries to those environments. God, and that doesn't mean cold turkey going up someone's door and just shoving the gospel down their throat. Are we committed? Are we willing to get to know our neighbors, to get our hands dirty, to enter into their stories, to do life with them, to walk with them, to be their friends, even if they never accept Jesus? But in the midst of all of that, are we willing to live in such unity with them that they see the love of Jesus in us? Are we willing to be neighbors? Give us the courage and the fortitude to do so, I pray in your name. Amen.